the people you meet, the conversations you have, and it's all fascinating, and everybody has a story. I think the big essence of this podcast is that everybody has a story, and people with stories know people with stories, and it became this open-ended pursuit of what else is there to know, what else I could learn, and human experience, our life is so fascinating. I feel like life writes stories that nobody could make up, right? And I've met people that have lived through. They had to move. They were refugees from different places. They made their life in a different part of the world, and they live with those stories. And if you pause and you ask them, you get to hear stories when you just ask people how they are, and give them space and time to share those stories. And I don't know, there's something really powerful about our human experience, and investing is just an excuse to explore those. And investing family wealth is just yet another permission to hear stories and be a part of their stories, and building those cathedrals that will last and outlast us all. Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. All right, I have John Candeto with me today. He was a guest on Talking Billions a few weeks ago, and he was kind enough to come back and become the guest host of the show and ask me questions in a long tradition of fireside chats that I started with Matt Ziegler probably about a year ago. So, John, thank you so much for coming back, and I know you've given it a lot of thought, and I'm very excited to have you back.
Yes, thank you for having me back. I'm excited to turn the tables and ask you some questions.
I love it. Let's do it.
All righty. So I've been reading your writing, and thank you for just what you put into the world. I think our species can never have too much high quality, thoughtful writing. So thank you. The thing that I think was most intriguing to me as I worked through it and thought about it was this thread that you pull in many different ways around the idea of investing a family fortune and how investing a family fortune is like no other kind of investing. That's a fairly specific, some might say bold statement. So can you just break that out a little bit for us? Tell us why investing a family fortune is like no other kind of investing.
I think it's a beautiful place to start. So I've been in the business 20 years, and I discovered investing, as you know, when I was a college student in Brussels, exchange student, and I picked up one up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch, and people listening to this podcast know the story. And I made up my mind I wanted to come to New York, work in the investment profession. And I was fortunate enough to end up at a firm that had long traditions managing money for families in the shape and the form that it was when I joined it, but there was a predecessor firm and the firm that existed even before. So the people I worked with had a lot of intellectual heritage that went back many generations, including a physical symbol of it, which was a desk that I sat at for a period of time that one of the senior partners used before, and his senior partner or partner back in the day used. And the story is that this desk might have been already 100 years old when I sat at it. And it had a secret compartment, but I'll save it for another story. I was cleaning it one day and I ended up finding notes from way back in the day. So it's true that this desk has been around in people's lives. And I can only imagine the conversations that people had sitting on both sides of that desk, both the advisors, advising families and family members that sat down on the other side of that desk and shared stories and concerns and worries and ambitions and dreams with a generation after generation of advisors. So I found investing and I immediately was thrusted into this world of family wealth investing in New York. And I got to appreciate two sides of it. So I was fascinated with the investing pursuit, as in finding investment ideas that make sense. And then the other side of it, whose money are we managing? Whose money are we investing? And I feel like not enough time is spent on that side because it matters. It creates a context. It gives your pursuit more meaning. What kind of money are we investing? $1 million is not equal to the other $1 million, right? If it's the only $1 million you have, it's very different than if it's 1 out of 100. And then turning that 1 into 2, into 4, into 8, into 16, and so on. What kind of an impact it has on people's lives. So I got to spend a lot of time with families that have had wealth over multiple generations and notice that there's a whole world of people that have cultivated certain principles and ideas and philosophies that allow that wealth to continue. And I mentioned in this podcast that I have this dream and aspiration that to take this idea and spread it to the point where nobody should really start with nothing again, as in the new generation. And we're talking about people living paycheck to paycheck, but I'm thinking, big picture. Each generation, in most of families you can think of, starts with nothing. There's no inheritance coming, or it's minimal. What can we do to cultivate those principles so that more of the families can start with something? And it doesn't have to be humongous, but it could be life-changing. It could be a down payment on the first house. It could be a way to help pay for college, or if it's, a more expensive university far away, the kids can go and do it. So having this kind of mindset of borrowing and spreading those ideas that a lot of those families I worked with over the years and I continue to work with have developed and cultivated that are applicable in more lives than ever. And I'm just going to say one more thing, that when you think about the last 100 years, we've created so much wealth as a civilization, and there are more and more families that face the challenge that used to be a challenge for the few before, where there is an inheritance and they have a lot of questions. How do we go about it? And it is a different money, different capital than any other capital. And the way we go about it, the respect that it deserves, the kind of risks that we're willing to accept and so on. And I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but just to set the stage, that's how I entered this world. And I've been very fortunate and blessed to be able to serve those families for the last 20 years.
Right. Is it, sometimes people say the way you get rich and the way you stay rich is different. Do you agree with that? How would you think that through?
So in my book, Money, Life, Family, I mention how when you really distill the stories of those families, many, many families, not just the ones I got to meet or heard about or know about, but if you expand the study, and I've done it writing that book, trying to figure out all the stories that are out there of successes and failures, you realize that the stories rhyme across centuries and locations around the world. And it's fascinating when people listen to this podcast and reach out from the other end of the globe and then say, that's what happened to my grandpa. And it's completely new distant place on earth. It's fascinating to see how it's so relatable. But the point is that the wealth creation usually happens with one business, one family, or sometimes one founding member, grandfather, grandmother, that started the business. And then you reach a certain point and interesting things can happen. One of them is, obviously the sale of a business, or turning this business into a multi-generational family business, which is a whole different journey that some families are on. But once you sell the business, it could become a collection of businesses. And it's a big picture idea when you think about wealth over time. Where does it belong, right? In terms of both preserving its purchasing power, which is the low hurdle, or the first hurdle you think of. And then you're thinking, how can we actually grow it over time? And the first business that allowed that opportunity to happen, so there is substantial life-changing multi-generational wealth, that might not be the business that will allow that family to perpetuate that. And there are exceptions, and there are families that have kept wealth within one business. But there are more stories of families that shifted towards a collection of businesses. And that's where stock investing eventually plays an interesting role, because it gives you an access to a whole variety of businesses where the money can continue to live on.
Yes. Yeah, you mentioned the, and this is all resonating very much. You mentioned the triple challenge in preserving a family fortune, and you mentioned sort of fortunes don't last, assets are finite, and then there's crashes, crises, and chaos. And so what you just said makes a lot of sense in the sense of assets are finite. Our species is yet to prove we can have one business that lasts forever, but we've proven that businesses as an asset, evolve and so on. But there's probably more today than there ever have been. So that makes sense that you want to be sort of in a way resilient to whatever the future looks like. If you have a collection of businesses, you're probably more resilient than if you have a single business. Can you say a little more about the other two pieces? So we've talked about assets are finite in a sense, and maybe that's one reason to have multiple businesses. But this notion of fortunes don't last, and crashes, crises, and chaos, which I imagine play off each other. Can you say a little more on those two pieces of the triple challenge?
So a little bit about the finite and infinite concept before we get to the other two. I like the idea of an infinite time horizon when you think about family wealth, and it's very important to me and to the families I work with to see that their investment horizon is truly open-ended. We're not talking about the next quarter, next year, 5 years. We're really talking about something that can be perpetuated. And I really like that you highlighted the fact that wealth might have a potential to have a life, an infinite life. But the assets we invest in are finite. And I think it's a humbling realization that you might have to change places, move on to the next businesses. Now, there's this idea that, there are the internal and external challenges with family wealth. But when you think about what can endanger a family fortune, what can get in the way of that family fortune lasting, well, one side of this, the investment side we talk about, then overspending and over-harvesting, so to speak, the asset that you have can also lead to a shrinking amount of money. And I had Fraser Rice on the show who brought up a concept that really resonated with me, and he kind of gave me vocabulary to explain it. And he said that even the richest people have to learn to live within the confines of their wealth. And the word confine, it's a very harsh word, right? I see maybe a box, maybe walls, maybe a fence. And you're thinking, I have all this money in the world. Why are we thinking about confines? But the realization is that even the largest fortune comes with some sort of limitation, right? Sure. And we've seen throughout history that even the largest fortunes can be lost, can be spent. And we know the tales of the Vanderbilts that I write about in the book, but there are others that overspent what they had. And that's a challenge. Now the crisis and everything else that can happen, it's something that's really important to me and personal in a way. I grew up in Poland in the 1980s, and Poland was not the place to keep your wealth for the last 100 years. The last 30 years or so have been very stable, and I hope that continues. But the prior century, you had 2 world wars, you had half a century of communism with confiscation and the government owning everything. And if it wasn't lost, then it was destroyed or it was taken away from you. So this was not the place. And Poland is no exception. There are a lot of places on earth where keeping wealth over a long period of time would not be achievable. I like this idea of, if you do get rich in this lifetime, however you define rich, it means different things to different people. Why isn't it immediately appealing to think of the second question, which I think is so much more interesting, is how do I get to keep it? Right? Because people think about, oh, I want to become a millionaire, I want to become a billionaire, whatever the number is that makes your heart tick. But
sure,
you reach that point, and then you're thinking, okay, I'm here. How do I keep it? And I think that's where the conversation gets so much more nuanced and interesting. And then in the book, I talk about location as one of the prerequisites in a way, right? Where do you think this wealth should belong? And I know quite a few people around the world even today that created wealth in the last generation or two. And they realize, and they reach out and talk to me about it, that the location that allowed them to create the wealth that they have might not be the location that will allow them to keep it.
Yes.
And whether it's the politics or the economy or the rules and the regulations and taxation and then so on, you have to realize that it's an exception that you created this kind of wealth, and it will attract a lot of attention one way or the other. And there will be interest in having a part of it taken away one way or the other. And I'm not thinking about, the French Revolution, but
Oh yeah, no, it's very much, I try to frame a lot of things in terms of, 10,000 years of human history. And if you zoom that far out, you realize that, no governance structure is 10,000 years. We don't have a 10,000-year-old country, or I don't think we have 10,000-year-old families, or at least ones that we know. There's no structure that has survived that long that you could have said, if I invested with them, if I held wealth in this area, if I had, it would have been. And so one of the things I read in your writing that just fascinated me was you talk about working with families whose fortunes were planted when Beethoven was writing symphonies.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I want you to share some of this, because that to me is a real, by luck or by skill, a real miracle that, to your point, for hundreds of years, there have been thousands or tens of thousands of humans, whether in the government or family, friends, or community, whatever. There have been many, 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 many people that have had many, many, many opportunities to try to get a piece. Mm-hmm. And yet somehow these fortunes have survived to the point where you get to be a steward of them. So say more. How did that work?
When I sit down with a new family that I get to know, and they could be clients, I tell them that, let's pause for a second. The fact that there's a fortune for us to even talk about, it's a miracle.
Yes.
Right? And the fact that this fortune, as far as we know, has been a part of your family for more than a generation, that's also a miracle. And if you had that success over multiple generations, that's really you defying the laws of proverbs, nature, and everything else in between, right? Mm-hmm. So let's pause for a second and acknowledge what happened here. And then we can, from that place of huge respect, very humbling, decide what we're going to do about it next. But it's fascinating to see that there are families that have accomplished it over many, many generations. And we are so obsessed about the top 100 or top 50, and we see the lists, and we also see the turnover on those lists. I think it's interesting to acknowledge that lists turn over quite a bit.
Yes. But
there are families that have successfully kept the wealth, lived within the limits, and continue to keep it in income-producing, productive assets over a long period of time. They avoided, family conflicts that would disrupt it, and they also made some location decisions. And here you might notice in my book that I'm very biased towards the U.S. in a positive way, because the U.S. has a long tradition. I'm looking at the runway, you're talking about 200 some years of a functioning system. Imperfect, I'll give you that. Changing and developing, constantly tested in many different ways. But there's a beautiful interview with Louis Lapham, and that Louis Lapham was the editor of, he passed away since, of the Harper magazine, and he talks in that interview, I think it's one of his last, I'll look it up and I'll include it in the notes, how the US was built not only to be a democracy, but also to be a place to acquire, grow, and keep wealth. When you really think about the structures, and I'm talking about the property rights, the respect for your ownership, and you know, it's a long and complicated history, but the last 200 years, if your great-great-grandparents owned some mineral rights, and I know families that have had that, you know, blessing and fortune, they're still around, and they could be still paying out something to you, right? Yes. And it might be minimal at this point, but the thread through history connects you with your ancestors in a way that's pretty, you know, remarkable. It makes you pause. It was not interrupted for a long period of time. So in that interview, he makes a point that, look, this country was built to be a democracy. It was built to avoid having an emperor, which I hope it still applies. Right. But also a country that if you make it, if you earn it, it's yours. Right. And we have, obviously there's taxation, you know, there's a social contract. We're trying to be a cohesive, you know, society, many different things. But at the end of the day, it's yours to keep. Many other places, there are different setups, different situations, even pension funds. Then every election, people are not so sure if their individual, you know, pension accounts, retirement accounts will be still in their name, because the governments are always sniffing around it if there's a way maybe to take it away from you. And countries, even in the last few decades, in places that are very developed, have taken things away from people. It's an intangible thing, John, that we might not even appreciate day to day, but there are people that are living in real fear that something will be taken away from them. And in the US, we're blessed not to think about it as much.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're getting at something that, if I zoom out on that a little bit, you mentioned if one is a student of history, you mentioned earlier in this conversation, there are things that rhyme between families that have managed to preserve wealth for generations. Or I think of this as the wisdom of the elders, maybe is one way to put it. But from that, you've sort of gleaned and I think practice a process of wealth preservation. And you've spoken to it a little bit in terms of being very thoughtful about where to do it. I know you also look at who and how. So can you say a little bit more maybe on the who and the how?
So when you think about financial capital, and I'm sure that this conversation will get more nuanced as we talk about other capitals, the social, intellectual, and so on. But when you think about just the financial capital, it has to belong somewhere, right? So let's say that you found out that you have this $50 million, $100 million inheritance coming your way. And let's say that magically it's only in cash, which is rare. Usually it's already in some sort of assets that you have to think about and decide. But let's say that it arrives all in US treasuries or cash. You have to make a decision. And even a lack of decision that you're going to leave it in US treasuries for a long period of time, which is allegedly a risk-free asset, but that's probably a separate topic if it really is a risk-free asset. But you want to have it invested in broadly defined income-producing assets, and we can narrow it down and realize that we're really talking about businesses. How was this wealth created? Most of the wealth out there, obviously there are some real estate fortunes, but really when even real estate fortunes are really business fortunes, there's a business behind it, right? So when you narrow it down, zoom in, distill it, we're talking about a business-created wealth that we're talking about, and business will allow us to perpetuate that wealth. Is it the same business that great-grandfather founded? Maybe. But it's not necessarily always the case. It might be a collection of businesses. But what are we trying to do? We're trying to compound and grow it over a long period of time. We can become or remain, continue to be owners of businesses. And I see the stock market as just this creation that you and I talked about, where you and I and anybody else, including the families we talk about here, can go in and acquire pieces of those businesses. That's what Peter Lynch told me in that book years ago that I read a quarter of a century ago, that stocks are small pieces of businesses. So those families no longer have to reinvent themselves and start a whole new business. I don't know, in steel or railroads or technology or shipping. They can become owners in a whole variety of businesses, which gives them the option to move the assets and the capital, financial capital, to yet more and different business opportunities as time passes. But it allows us to create this open-ended opportunity for this capital to continue to grow. The reason I'm especially drawn to business ownership and the stock market as being the place where I can buy those businesses is that I'm thinking of real estate. If I buy a home on a desirable street, I lived in Brussels as a student, which I mentioned in my TED Talk, and it was a beautiful street 100 years ago. There were pictures of it in one of the museums, and there were horse carriages and very nicely dressed people. Now, as you can imagine, students live in more affordable neighborhoods. So this became a more affordable neighborhood when I was a student. And let's say I bought a house on that block in 1908. After 100-some years, I still have just one house on one street, and hopefully the neighborhood is as desirable as it was when I bought it. Now, if you buy 1,000 shares, or if you talk about percentages, let's say 0.1% of Coca-Cola in 1908, then you have, even ignoring buybacks, the shrinkage of share count, you own a piece of a much bigger, better business. No endorsement to Coca-Cola. It's just been around for a long time and people can relate to it. But after 100 years, you own a multiple and multiple and multiple of a business that's bigger, better, right? So that's why, to me, if you have a long period of time, you can't really compete with what the investment in businesses can offer compared to many other opportunities. And obviously, you can own businesses privately. Just public markets are such a amazing creation that allows you to participate in other people's innovations, entrepreneurship, and drive. And all you need is as much as it takes to buy a single share.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm thinking about the last time we were on this podcast. We talked about the idea that, imagine a few hundred years ago, somebody had said to you, in the not too distant future, it will be possible for you to grow your wealth alongside and in exactly the same way as the most talented wealth creators on the planet. To use your words, if you just have enough money to buy a single share, or even today a fraction of a share, that's really astounding when we really think about it. It's, if you frame it that way, it's sort of, do you want to put your money into a property on a beautiful street in Brussels that may or may not be a beautiful street 100 years from now? Or do you want to put your money with someone who has proven to be, or an engine that's proven to be, a phenomenal wealth creator for many, many, many decades? And of course, the data proves this as well. I mean, one has drastically outperformed the other, but when you frame it that way, I agree. I think you make that point well.
You ask about the who. And I think it's very important because the who has two parts to it, at least. One is the family, the family members, and then the advisors. And I don't mean just the investment advisors, but your accountant, your lawyer.
Right.
And sometimes there's a confidant within the family or part of the family circle. And I had this fascinating conversation with a good friend who is a mentor, Jay Hughes, who has worked with many affluent families over, I think by now, close to half a century. And he told me, when a family inherits wealth, and I think it's a profound truth or a belief, it's not just the financial capital that they inherit the whole ecosystem that comes with it. The people that helped this family, guided this family through the process. And in a way, that ecosystem, that circle, that brain trust might be more valuable than the financial capital itself. It's a chicken and egg because they coexist. But when you really think about it, they carry the stories, the intellectual heritage, and the people I've met and whoever was sitting at the desk that I enjoyed for a period of time. I'm thinking of they were the ones that sat down with the next generation of 21-year-olds and told them the story. And they are the ones that guided them through the process.
Yes.
When you think about inheritance as an experience, there's a beautiful book by Joni Brontman, The Inheritance Experience, and she tells the story and interviews with people that experienced inheritance. And it's something that you can empathize with and try to understand and try to feel what it's like. But it's a fascinating human experience. You're born into something, and you're almost landing in an unknown world to you. How do you even coexist with this life-changing family fortune? And how do you find your way in the world? And there's lots of books and lots of studies and lots of stories about it, but it's a fascinating phenomenon that you are immediately responsible, invited to be responsible for this fortune that will outlast you and maybe many more generations to come. How do you go about it? And how do you interact with it? And I think we've learned over the last 100 years a lot on that front, from a world where maybe the next generation would be excluded from the conversation to seeing much more inclusion here, where the younger generation is aware of something coming their way, which I think is very, very helpful, because they can start to think about it and prepare for it and be a part of the conversation. And then over the years, I had interns that came from families that I worked with, and they chose professions that have nothing to do with investing. Many of them did. But because they spent some time with me when they were 21, they feel empowered to ask the right questions when they're 30 and 35, and when they have a voice in the room. And it brings me a lot of joy to see that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I love the, I came across this line from Terry Pratchett the other day that says, no one is finally dead until the ripples they cause in the world die away. The span of someone's life is only the core of their actual existence. And I, that idea you're suggesting as well, that we sort of echo beyond just, even when we stop breathing, we can leave things that echo. It reminds me of, I had not heard this story till I read it in your writing. And so I'll ask you to recount it here, but a man inherits $1 million and then learns that there's some conditions associated with inheriting the million. So could you, could you share that story and then maybe break out, what we can take from that? That just struck me as what a blessing that man had. I think it was the grandfather who set this up for him to learn something he desperately needed to learn, but might not otherwise have. So please, if you can share the story, I would love that.
So you're asking about Brewster's Millions, a book that I really like, that I brought up on the show a couple of times, and I wrote about it. It's a story from 100 years ago or so. It's a short novel, and you could read as a comedy. You could find it funny. It was actually turned into a comedy movie. But the movie obviously doesn't give justice to the actual story. And if you come from the investment profession, and especially if you come from the family wealth investment side of the world, you appreciate, I did, reading this book, because it's a story of young men living in New York that finds out about an inheritance. And there's a family feud that's being settled by having him receive one inheritance that he has to lose, and then a second one that he could have much bigger if he can get rid of the first one, basically. And here he actually has to part with that money, poorly invest, waste it away, and not have anything left. And in that process, he learns quite a bit about wealth, money, financial capital, and himself as well. So when the time comes and when he's ready for the next inheritance, he's in a completely different place. And I'm not going to give more away, but the book is just dense with lessons when it comes to inherited wealth, which is something, as I brought up before, more of us will experience in the coming years because of the wealth creation we've seen, and more families have something to pass on, which I think it's wonderful. And I think even more families could and should and maybe will be able to do that. So the question and the topic will be much more relevant to more people. And I've met families where there are stories of previous wealth, and they know that there was a fortune in the family. And Lewis Lapham himself, who I brought up, tells the story how he grew up with a family with a multi-generational family fortune, but by the time he came around, there were just stories and tales of it and not enough. So he had to go and find a job. And it's a fascinating idea that I call it the lack of the dress rehearsal moment. So when you do receive an inheritance, when you do find out about it, or when you know it's looming or coming, and hopefully it's given with warm hands. I like this idea of a gift with warm hands. But when it is coming, this is it. Like you have to jump in and make decisions and engage help that is needed to make the right decisions, because there is in the real world no second inheritance coming that's bigger and could replace the one you're about to lose, right? So I think that's the biggest lesson from this book. And the second lesson is that any fortune can be lost, really. And we've seen multi-billion-dollar fortunes. Only yesterday, I had somebody on the show, I'm not going to mention who, but he told me a story of somebody who was in his life, who in one lifetime created a multi-billion-dollar fortune. Somebody that you and I probably don't know, and I'm not going to mention the name, but it's somebody that lost it all through a couple of bad investments. And it's somebody that's really, really smart, but I think misjudged the risk and reward that come with some of the investments, and is back to square zero to the point that he's receiving checks from the government to get by. And he says he's fine about it. I'd love to talk to him at some point, by the way. But I think the lesson here is that there are certain risks that even the richest people in the world cannot afford. And I think it's a very important realization, because on one hand, even the largest fortune will have some sort of confines in terms of how much you can actually spend. And the second thing is that there are certain risks that even if you have all the money in the world, you cannot afford to accept. And I think that's that beautiful balance that you can perpetuate through generations, and realize that, yes, I want to participate in the success of certain businesses that make sense to me. But on the other hand, there are certain choices I will definitely make to avoid certain risks that can completely derail what I'm trying to do. And I'll bring up quickly Luca Dallana, who was on the show. You might be familiar with his work.
Yes.
And the idea of a game over, which really, really resonated with me. And I was looking for the right way to describe it. And I think he beautifully describes it, how it's not the fastest skier that wins the competition, but the one that actually makes it until the end.
Yes.
And we don't think about it because we praise the success at all costs. But with a family fortune, the success is that there is something tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after. And 100 years from now, there's still something. So you and I can sit down and, as I said before, pause for a second and say, it's a miracle that it's even here. But it took a series of smart decisions made by the family and everybody involved. And there are people that have this kind of intellectual heritage helping those families on this path. And we don't have to make those mistakes on our own. There are others that have made them. And there's this accumulated knowledge that you can rely on and tap into and depend on this journey that can guide you.
Yes, absolutely. So this gets us to something I've been excited to talk to you about, because I don't think we've covered it before. You mention often that investing is a game with no end. And of course, the only way you can play a game with no end is to never have a game over, as Luca would say. And I think when one really thinks about that, as we've suggested throughout this conversation, that is a very hard problem. There's, you have to get the where right, you have to get the who right, you have to get the how right, and you have to do that for years and decades and centuries and possibly even millennia. We're recording this the day after the U.S. elections. And so, of course, just a fire hose of information yesterday and through the night, a fire hose of information when capital markets, opened this morning. But I think we would agree, there's almost nothing in any of that information flow that reminds us that this is a game with no end. It just the brain power, the movement of capital, the movement of information, the way things are talked about, the language that's used, who shows up how. it plays on our psychology. It plays on our sort of the worst of our greed and fear and all that. So my question, or maybe a place to take this, is I would love to know, what do you do? We're not surrounded by things that remind us that this is an infinite game. So what do you do, and maybe what do you do with your clients to just remind you that we're playing an infinite game here? And how do you kind of keep that front of mind?
I think it's a beautiful question, and there are a few ways to go about it. So one is what you choose to filter out and tune out, right? And it's a practice. And I think we have an onslaught of very short-lived information out there. And Nick Sleep said that once that news is just new, right? It doesn't mean it's relevant. It doesn't mean it's just new. It's something new they have to tell you. And I think when you look at news this way, and I don't watch television, and I don't read daily newspapers, I'm looking for information that has a longer shelf life, things that can actually matter. Something that you and I talk about today, and I mentioned to you, I like the concept of evergreen. What's evergreen? What's relevant today? And if you and I sit down 20 years from now and say, you know what we talked about 20 years ago, it's still relevant in what we do and how we go about it. That's what I'm looking for, and that's what this podcast has been. I'm not curious about what's the hottest stock of the week or what's the best performing stock today. I don't even know. I'm curious about being directionally right and finding those long-lasting, important truths or principles or rules or wisdom that can help in the process. So it's tuning out.
Right.
On the other hand, I feel like those families have created this beautiful environment of cultivating knowledge and wisdom. And you talked about the elders, but I think having this capacity to find out what that wisdom is and how you can codify it in a way and find the right hands to pass it on. And you said something beautiful that I really like, that ripple effect of you are no longer here, but because you were present, that ripple effect happens. And I've been in meetings with families where we talk about what would the grandfather do or say when he's no longer with us. And it's such a profound, powerful moment when you realize he made it so, or she made it so obvious and clear what their intentions are, that we're saying this in the room, 10 or 20 years since they passed. Right. And we know what they would like to happen. Right. And, there are legal documents, there are trust documents and so on, but I think there's this intangible wisdom that gets passed on. And I definitely have done things that my grandfathers would be proud of, like you kind of have that feeling of the other generations would approve. We talked about Charlie and Warren, like if they were sitting, would they approve of what I'm doing, right? Like you have that kind of mentors within the family and outside of the family. Would they approve of what I'm doing? So I think that creating this intangible system of passing on knowledge. And speaking of knowledge, and I know that you and I love reading and we're curious and we want to understand things. When you think about human knowledge that we've accumulated over the last few thousand years of, written word, and we had stories and fairy tales and tales before, but we build on what was built before, right? Yes. We continuously build. When it comes to financial capital, we often fail at it. So we build all this little wealth throughout our life, and then it gets erased somehow, and the next generation starts with nothing. Imagine that with every generation, we got rid of all the books and all the knowledge that we have, and we had to start over again. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. Why would we do it, right? We go back and we read Plato, and how many generations have read Plato and Aristotle, and we learn how to structure a play that these days we use to structure a book, a novel, a movie, a TV show, right? So those ideas continue through generations. Yes. I'd love to see that with financial capital, which is, it's a label, but I'm thinking of the wealth, the money, the purchasing power that you can pass on to the next generation that can give options and peace of mind. When you think about that wealth, and people think about substantial wealth, they might think for a minute, oh, this is money to be spent. Right. I think it's a massive mind shift when you realize you're just a steward of that capital. Yes, you will benefit from it in your lifetime, but this is not the money to be spent in the next year or two, right? It's a completely different mind shift that I think a lot of other people would consider where they how they think about it, like a lottery win, right? It's money to be spent on the house, on the boat, on the trip. That's a completely different mindset than when you inherit wealth, that you are in a role, it's stewardship of capital for the next generations. Mm-hmm. It's a very different place to start.
Yeah, I'm reminded of somebody asked one time, what do you need to do to become a wonderful ancestor? Mm-hmm. And it's such a great framing, right? It forces to think beyond your life into what do you want for the generations that come after you. Another way I've heard it put is, what gifts will you leave for unborn generations to come? Mm-hmm. And those framings are just so clarifying. And then, of course, I think if done well, then when the unborn generations come, they come into an example of stewardship. As like what's the Patek Philippe line? You never actually own one. You just look after it for the next generation. That's modeled. And, if you want to take the Proverbs angle, train up a child in the way he shall go, and when he's old, he won't deviate from it. If you can mm-hmm. get that going, get that flywheel mm-hmm. spinning, I think your odds of perpetuating it go up and up and up. I was talking to someone, I think it was our mutual friend, Eric Markowitz, who is he's going deep right now on why have some businesses lasted 400 years, 1,000 years? Why have some, you write about a tree I did not know about that has lasted thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we were kicking around was the idea that, we know from data, most businesses die very young. Yes. And then there's this sort of drop-off rate. And what we were thinking through was, it seems like, and I imagine this is true of families too, if you survive past a certain point, and that might be several generations, but if you survive past a certain point, the odds that you keep surviving probably stop declining and start going up again, because you figured something out about how to, cross the chasm from generation 1 to 2 to 3 and so on.
True.
Yeah. What is, I know you're friends with Anthony Deedon, and I think he's spoken uniquely clearly, and he's probably thought uniquely well on this topic. So I'm just curious, what have you learned from him as it relates to, whether it's the dollar you can never get again, or just what have you learned and taken from Anthony into your own practice of this craft?
So, in a word, I would say respect. The respect that he has for the capital that he manages. And I think that's something that we can all take away and learn from. I think the investment profession would really benefit if we could, for a moment, see how much respect people's lifetime of savings requires. Not even inheritance, but saving over a lifetime for retirement, which is what a lot of people aspire to do. Mm-hmm. What kind of respect that requires? How many compromises and sacrifices they had to take for that money to be there, right? So that respect. And he has this immense respect, and he talks about how that money really came about slowly. He calls it savings. The other thing that he talks about that I really like is the idea that you touched on, which is planting trees for others to enjoy. And I want to come back to the longevity of the businesses in a second too. But he tells a story of, and he repeated it more than once, how he met this farmer who plants palm trees that give dates. And he's harvesting the dates today that his father or grandfather planted, and he's planting new ones that his son or grandson will harvest. And it's such a beautiful image of family fortune, because the investments we make today will give us real benefits down the road. And I'm not talking about the 5 or 10% upside. I'm talking about growing wealth over a long period of time, from 2 to 4, from 4 to 8, from 8 to 16 to 32, and double and double and double. Like at some point, like Buffett has investments that pay in dividends more today than it cost to acquire them before. Like for a moment, when you let it sink in, right?
It's phenomenal.
You planted a seed. And then that seed is giving you so much in terms of harvest and down the road. So all those ideas that Tony talks about are those traditional ideas of family wealth advisors that I was exposed to working in New York for 2 decades, with that kind of intellectual heritage of people that thought about family fortunes this way and had that kind of respect. And I think the industry became much more commoditized and became a different world. I think much more sales driven and so on, and went through all kinds of phases. But I think that voice that Tony shares with the world was the voice, and I hope will continue to be among trusted family advisors for decades to come. And I think more people could hear it, should hear it.
Yes.
And I know a lot of people around the world that have heard Tony speak and then see him as this beam of light, and it sets that shows the direction of how it could be done.
Right.
And then you can take it in any direction you want, but there are certain principles that are timeless and evergreen when it comes to wealth, and even your own family wealth. How do you really think about it? And it changes the conversation. One thing I want to mention is when you think about investing as a very competitive game pursuit, now if you extend your time horizon from the quarter to quarter game that a lot of people play to 3 or 5 years, or even decades. And I've been in meetings with CEOs where in the room of 20 analysts, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I was the only one that asked anything about something beyond the next quarter. And the CEO would say, can you stay over and can we talk to you? And I wasn't even asking about the next 25 years. I was just asking, what's the bigger plan? There was something that they were doing. And they thought, it's such a relief. We can talk to somebody about the bigger plan.
Right.
Because when you think about the day-to-day game, it's very, very competitive. You and I could bet $1 with a 50-50 odds of the market closing up or down. I think actually today will be more of an up, but had we not known what the election outcome would be, who knows?
Sure.
Anyways, 50-50 coin toss. But if you and I are thinking about a 10, 20, or 50 or 100-year bet, for lack of a better word, of participation in the ownership of businesses through the stock market, the odds are much more in our favor, especially if we give it some thought and what we own, how we own. And that brings me to longevity, which is a fascinating concept, and I've been trying to approach it from different angles. I wrote a piece that I called 20 Stocks for 20 Years, and it was inspired by a client that asked the question, if I was to gift one stock to a child that was just born, what stock would it be? And I could have an immediate answer and say, whichever one I just bought, maybe you should have it too. But I thought, no, I think he's asking might not know, but he's asking a bigger question, which I reframed and rephrased in my head. What kind of a stock deserves a 20-year wait? And it's a unique proposition because this child will not need this money, move this money, touch this money, spend this money for 20 years, right? So for an investment mind, it's a fascinating mental model to explore for a second. So it's not just a business that will survive, right? So then you say, then pick a business that's been around for 100 years. It will be around in 20 years. Sure, you can do that. But you're thinking about 20 years. What kind of a business will take advantage of 2 decades to become bigger, better, and more valuable than today, right? It has to be one that's already publicly traded because that's the choices we have for this particular experiment. It showed us that it's reliable, it has profits, it's growing, but also one that has a long, long runway ahead of itself. And it completely reframes the conversation, right? You're in a completely different game, and it's just 2 decades, right? So that's fascinating. Then there are studies, and I mentioned in that piece that I wrote, that companies are at the peak of what they can perform, deliver for 2 decades or so. So they have this stage of, I don't know if it's going to work out. And then they have this stage, we've been doing so well and we're just managing, a decline. And then in the middle, usually they're about 18, 20 years where everything is working out. Margins are improving. Growth is great. New products are showing up. New markets can be penetrated, and on and on and on. I had Aswav Damodaran, professor from NYU, on the show. And I hope this episode will come out about the same time. But we were talking about the life of a business, and he has a new book that I highly recommend, and he goes really, really deep in understanding the different stages of a life of a company. I read about it and wrote about it in Outsmarting the Crowd, my first book. There was a a small book about the life of a company, and I haven't seen since a good study of it. And he has done a remarkable job understanding what kind of shareholders participate in different businesses at different stages. Where he talks about capital allocation, and he talks about even valuation. When you, for example, say that this stock is cheap because it's a single-digit PE, it might be actually expensive because it's shrinking at an incredible pace. You and I know that, right?
What's the line? All stocks get very cheap on the way to bankruptcy.
There you go. So he really hones in and explains the different life stages of a business. And when you think about a family, 100-year time horizon, there are different businesses that make sense within a portfolio, right? When you think about portfolio construction, and there are different ways to go about it, you might realize that you need a little bit of different businesses in that portfolio. One part could be for income because the family is living off that capital. The other part could be more appreciation and growth driven, and on and on and on. I mean, there are fascinating things that you can look about it. And I'll just mention Chris Mayer, that I'm sure you're familiar with his work in the 100 Beggars, and Thomas Phelps that wrote a book, 100 to 1 or 1 to 100. But when you have a long runway, you could actually aspire to find businesses that could go up, 50 times or 100 times. Will they all go up that much? I don't think so. But because you altered the filter that you're applying, you will be looking at businesses that can make a big difference in that kind of capital over the long run.
Yes, very much, very much. So this gets at, I wanted to ask you about, you've written that it will take the words were massive rethinking to secure multi-generational success in wealth preservation and growth. And obviously a lot of this feeds into that. So can you maybe go to from that angle? What needs to be rethought? And obviously these ideas of assets we can hold for decades, not days, and so on feeds into that. But tell us about the rethinking that needs to be done, and maybe where you are in that rethinking.
A lot of families that I meet, they are usually not in the first generation, but in the second, third, or fourth, or fifth. I have met people that were overlapping generations. So they were born into a family that created a business. They work within the business, and the business might have been sold by the time we meet. But I think, as to make a point here, when you have somebody that created wealth, the first generation wealth creator, that person took very big risks, however you want to define them. They bet on one industry, one business, one idea. And even if you meet them later in their life, when they're comfortable, they have to come to the realization that they're no longer in this wealth creation phase, but they're entering the wealth preservation. When I say preservation, it doesn't mean that it will just keep up with inflation. Fortunes do grow when they compound at a decent rate, many times over lifetimes. They do. But it's a mindset shift from a single business, single idea, single big bet, that they put in all their time and life and everything into it, which is remarkable. And I noticed that some people come to that realization on their own, and they can tell that it takes a different mindset to go from where they are to creating something that could be a multi-generational family fortune and last longer. There's so many fortunes that have not even lasted throughout one generation, where you create it and you part it. Just as the example that somebody shared with me yesterday, who's somebody that made billions and is living in a government subsidized housing now in the later part of his life because of certain risks he underestimated. So most of the stories, many of the stories are such stories that you create the wealth and you keep applying the same risks all over again when you cannot afford to accept them anymore. It's very different when Bill Gates tells the story that his risks when he was a dropout from college, he could also always go back, always get a degree, always get a job, right? It's a very different place than when you're already sitting on a substantial life-changing family fortune. You're not Bill Gates at 17. You're not. And I think it's a harsh realization. That's why we have almost unlimited number of tales of, I'm thinking of Ike Batista, who is a Brazilian billionaire. I don't know if you know the story, who created, I think he had the aspiration of becoming the richest person in the world with lots of leverage in highly cyclical businesses where he, with high fixed costs, you know where this is going.
I do, yes. Well, tell the story though. It's an incredible story.
At some point, and I remember watching him when he was so confident he will become the richest person. I remember watching an interview with him, and I was thinking that things lined up for him so beautifully again and again and again. So it's almost like you're at a casino at that point. You're doubling and doubling and doubling, and then eventually you realize there's a moment when those risks will catch up with you. And this is the Luca Delana game over moment. For him, it was a game over moment. And I think he had a negative multi-billion-dollar net worth when it all collapsed. I haven't heard about him since, but he's not the only one. There were others. But there's a moment where you have to shift the mindset from creating wealth to preserving it. Right. And sometimes it's not possible to do it within one generation. I realize that. And it's the next generation that picks up and moves on. And it's that generation that they know that they're not in a position to recreate that wealth. They're not. Circumstances that were available 50 years ago or 40 years ago in that particular opportunity that the family enjoyed are no longer applicable, right? So they know they can't create it all over again. And it gives you a lot of respect for the fact that now we can invest it over the long run, but we can't afford to lose it. I like this idea that it's the capital that clients don't immediately need.
Yes.
And the capital they can't afford to lose. It's such a beautiful framework that I like to apply. Because if you bring $1 million to me and you say, I'd like to invest it, but I might need it in 6 months because I'm trying to buy a house, then it's not the money that can be invested. We're really talking about money that I told Jim O'Shaughnessy that I would call it forgotten money in a way. Yeah. It's the capital that for a period of time, you know it's there. You'll know it's there, but you can almost forget it. So it's not part of the daily equation of your investment ideas, funding your friend's restaurant and all those things. It's money that's almost out of the picture, so it can be committed for a long period of time in a way that's productive and can compound the wealth.
Yeah, very much, very much. You and I have similar frames on that. There's magic that's possible with money you don't need. So that brings us to you started a new firm this year, Blue Infinitus Capital, and I'm assuming, but I want to hear from you. I'm assuming that a lot of what we've talked about, the philosophy of how to do this, the wisdom of the elders, I know you've poured all that into the firm. I also imagine in some ways maybe you almost had to start a firm to be able to put some of this into practice. So can you just say more about why you launched the firm and what it's enabled you to do and so on?
I love what I do. And when I say that, I mean, I love helping families with this beautiful journey they're on. I find the pursuit absolutely fascinating. And with each new client, each new family, to me, it's just so interesting to learn about where they came from, where they're going, and how I can help. And I've seen thousands of situations and cases, and I can offer all that I've learned and seen so that they don't have to make the mistakes on their own all over again because somebody else has done it already. I think that's the big lesson. And I think it's absolutely okay to ask for help. I think it's very, very important that there are people that can help, whether it's me or somebody else, it doesn't matter, but there are people that can help. And it might be overwhelming in the moment when you find out about an inheritance, even if it's been looming for a while and you do need help. There's no dress rehearsal. And that's where the conversation starts. I was thinking about the next 2 decades at least. So I've been in the business 2 decades. I had a wonderful experience, 2 different places. One that I grew with the firm that had expanded quite a bit. And then I co-founded a firm where I spent the second half of my career so far. And I really enjoyed it and worked with some wonderful families. And I was thinking about the next 2 decades or so. And what kind of environment I like to set up and what kind of clients I'd like to work with. And I get to enjoy working with families that fit the profile that I mentioned. And then I was able to create what Derek Sivers called a bit of your own utopia when you create your own business. So you look at all the building blocks, and I know you've experienced it too, when you're thinking, what serves me? What can somebody else do for me? And where do I want to deploy the most of my time? I think time's the most precious asset. So I want to spend time with clients and looking for investments. Everything else I want to find a way for somebody else to take care of for me. And when you're part of a larger institution, you're part of meetings, committees, you're elected and selected to different, events and so on. And you realize how much your time goes away and gets dissipated. If you can leave me alone in the room and I can read, and then if I'm needed, I jump on the call or I travel and I see clients, between the two things, the two experiences, I'm very, very happy. So that's how I wanted to structure my time, my world. And Blue Infinitas is that kind of a vision, expression of it. And that the essence of it all is having, that's why I put the word infinitas. Blue, for me, it's this open-ended, open horizon. I sail and I fly and I see the blue sky and I'm thinking, I don't know what's ahead, but I'm excited. I'm optimistic about the future. And infinitas as infinity. And I like that it's a Latin word because Latin is considered, classical language, maybe a dead language in some way because we don't speak it anymore. It's not used. But so it's a connection between the past, the present, and then looking into infinity, the future. And it's a beautiful bridge in my mind in what I'm trying to do. When a family fortune, we were talking about a family fortune, we were talking about the past, how this family fortune came about. We're talking about the present, what can we do so that this family fortune can be around in the future. And when I think of it I think of it in a dynamic way, not what the family fortune is today, but what it could be if you give it time, right? And I've seen what a life-changing experience it is when the family fortune grows over time. And then the next generation has options, choices, dreams that they can pursue. Take a gap here. But the fact that it's just present, we talked about forgotten money. Like there are moments when the clients, their life goes in normal way, they're busy with things. And then they know that there's this presence in their life of a family fortune that they can rely on when they need it. And it doesn't have to be a big amount. I think sometimes even a smaller amount can be life-changing for some families. But the fact that it's there, it's waiting, it's sitting, and can be relied on, it completely changes how they operate day to day. Sometimes it's a conversation with a boss you don't want to work with and you can say no to. How empowering that is, right? And it's all those little things that I can tell and I can see, and they come up in conversations where I see the blessings of the presence of that family fortune, and it gives meaning to what I'm doing, right? So it's not just that I find stocks that could go up. Mm-hmm. Some of them don't, of course, but it goes way beyond that. It's almost like that story of bricklayers and three brick. I'm sure you know the story. They ask one, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm laying bricks." The other one says, "I'm putting up a wall." And the third one stretches and looks up. He says, "I'm building a cathedral."
Yes.
And that's what I'm doing here with those families. Yes. We're building a cathedral,
Yes.
And Nick Sleep said investing is a spiritual journey. Mm-hmm. And I really like that idea. That's he talked about his nomad firm, that it was a spiritual pursuit. Mm-hmm. And that's how I look at it. It's a spiritual pursuit that spans generations, and we're just playing a role for a period of time. I hope I get to live as long as Charlie and be as sharp as he was in his last years, mm-hmm. and have that kind of an impact in those families' lives.
Yeah, you're reminding me of, I was not aware of this till I read it in your writing, but apparently Ben Graham would open his class at Columbia with a Spinoza quote, "Insofar as the mind sees things in their eternal aspect, it participates in eternity." Mm-hmm. I think that's the bricklayer who realizes they're building a cathedral.
Yes.
And that's, I think, what Blue Infinitas, that's your vehicle to be part of, participate in that way, which is, that's fantastic. I love that. Let me nudge us towards a close here. I have two closing questions for you. So you mentioned you're a pilot, you're a sailor. I also know you surf, you dive. And so I have to ask, if you, for whatever reason, if you took a year and just said, I'm going to do something really interesting, what would you do? Would you fly around the world? Would you, dive the Marianas Trench? What would you point your efforts at?
Goodness. I love the question. I have a friend who might be listening who is contemplating flying around the planet, the globe, in a small plane. And I really like this idea. I also ride a motorcycle, and in New York, my wife and I would take the motorcycle on weekends all around New York. And there's something really unique that happens when you're on a motorcycle, because people interact with you in a different way. In a car, you're enclosed, and there's a wall, and there's glass, and you don't talk to anybody. But you pull up with a motorcycle, and you take a little ferry out in Long Island between those little islands, and you explore. People walk up to you, and you hear stories and conversations that you wouldn't experience otherwise. And I think when we fly commercial, from a place to a place, we show up, we get on the plane in New York, then we wake up in LA, and then we wake up in Singapore. And there you are in a completely different world. Flying small planes, you can stop in different places and you can experience them from a much lower altitude. And obviously the weather gets in the way, but I think there's some parallel to that motorcycle experience, that I think you can see more of the world in a different way. With sailing, I like the fact that it's an opportunity to truly slow down, because the boats don't move as fast. So my wife and I would sail from an island to an island in the Caribbean, and you pull into places where you can't really get in with a car, and you meet people, and then they come and they visit on the boat, and it's a whole different pace of travel. I'm a big fan of slow travel. So if I had a year, I think it would be a year of slow travel and being places and stopping in places and feeling places. And I know that you enjoy that too, and you experimented with that too. There's something different when you go to a place for 4 days and you already know you're checked in on your return flight. And instead of that, being somewhere where you're not so sure when the return flight is coming, you might rebook it.
Yes, you're there for the adventure. Yeah,
the people you meet, the conversations you have, and it's all fascinating, and everybody has a story. I think the big essence of this podcast is that everybody has a story, and people with stories know people with stories, and it became this open-ended pursuit of what else is there to know, what else I could learn, and human experience, our life, is so fascinating. I have a hard time reading fiction. My wife makes fun of me. I feel like life writes stories that nobody could make up, right? And I've met people that have lived through. They had to move. They were refugees from different places. They made their life in a different part of the world, and they live with those stories. And if you pause and you ask them, I was making copies in an office in New York, and there's this gentleman who was a temp, and I paused and I talked to him and I asked how he is, and I actually meant it, which is, I think, a very powerful thing to do, to actually ask people how they are. And he realized that I was there for that minute or two, giving him full presence. And he told me that he walked out of the towers, the World Trade Towers, on 9/11 in the morning. And he walked out and he survived. He said, I didn't believe the announcements that were supposed to wait. He said, I just walked out. Wow. You get to hear stories when you just ask people how they are.
Yes.
And give them space and time to share those stories. And I don't know, there's something really powerful about our human experience, and investing is just an excuse to explore those. And investing family wealth is just yet another permission to hear stories and be a part of their stories, and building those cathedrals that will last and outlast us all.
Very much. I love that. I love that answer. I go collect stories. That's phenomenal. So the last question, I know you are a TEDx speaker, and so my last question is, what will the next TED Talk be on?
It's fascinating. The more I ask people about money topics, which this podcast started with, the more I realize there are bigger topics to talk about. That money is just the underlying foundation, maybe an element, a thread. And then one big topic that comes up is time, how our time is precious. Yes. You can always borrow and make more money. You can't borrow time. And in Zurich at the airport, there's this one bank commercial advertising that says time is money. And every time I pass it, I always think, is that so? Like, there's a limit to that belief. And when it comes to that, I've been thinking a lot about purpose. And there's this beautiful book that's coming out that I got to read. It was written by Jordan Grummett, who is a hospice doctor who wrote a book, Taking Stock. His lessons from spending time with people that are passing away. And he wrote a book, Purpose Code, that will come out in the coming month or two. And he will be on the show as well. Mm-hmm. And he talks in a nutshell about the small P and the big P. We spend a lot of our time thinking about the big P, big purpose, which is I'll become the richest person in the world, or I'll become the whatever, the most successful in I don't know, best-selling novelist. Instead of thinking of the small piece that we play, which is the impact that we have on people in our life, the little purpose, the parents getting kids to school, or the grandparents walking. My grandfather would walk me in the morning sometimes, and I have memories of conversations that we had. These are the little moments, the little purpose, the little wins that we collect through our life that might not be on the cover of a magazine, but they mean sometimes more than the big P. And the thing that he says in the book, and I don't want to give out too much away, but he says that you can't really lose in the pursuit of the little purpose. Because it's your own purpose, it's your own inner scorecard, right? If your goal is to be kind to others, there's no way you can fail at it, right? You can fail at the game when you say that there's only one way to win, like presidential election, right? There's a winner and a loser from last night. So if you set your mind of, I'm going to become the president of the United States, you limit yourself to one outcome that will make you a success or not. But with the little purpose, just being kind to others, or helping them, or being of service to others, I think there's a powerful thing there. And Dr. Grummett, being a hospice doctor, he was a doctor first, and then was interested in financial independence, and he went into the hospice care later on. But he has fascinating stories and lots of lessons about what life is all about. And I don't think we have to wait until our time is almost up in terms of our time on this planet to think about it. I think it's beneficial to think about it earlier. And I think his work and his books and his thoughts are life-changing. And maybe he's on my mind because I just finished reading his book, and it really made a lasting impression on me. But
sure,
let's think about the little purposes in our life and how we can serve others. And I truly believe that in the work that I do, I'm serving others. And I was called to do it, and I would do it even if I had to pay to do it. That's the truth. And I feel very, very grateful that there are families that want to have me in their life, and I can help in so many ways. And I'm hoping to be doing this for as long as I can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. That's a beautiful answer and a beautiful way to wrap this conversation. Thank you for letting us turn the tables here and letting me ask the questions this time. This was fun, and thank you for your answers, and I hope others enjoy listening to this as well.
John, thank you so much. I know how much time and thought you gave into this, and how well prepared you were, and all the reading you've done, and I really appreciate the flow that we had and the topics we touched on. It was absolutely incredible, so I'm very grateful for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.